Imagine you're the governor of California. You see people on the street in the throes of addiction, in a cycle of homelessness, and you want to help them. But this is what happens.
You see me out there in overpasses, and we had direct issues in Oakland when I was out trying to clean up 4 encampments there. I was told we couldn't do it. It made no sense to me. I said, where's the compassion? We still have nightmares around one of the encampments where I think felt like a scene out of one of Raiders of Lost Ark, where thousands and thousands of rats appeared. Running all around us, up us, it felt like up our sleeves, needles strewn everywhere, feces everywhere, no compassion whatsoever, leaving people in those conditions when we had an alternative, but the judge was saying you can't use that alternative because of this court rulings.
Is homelessness a protected class? Is it a choice? Should cities be allowed to ban sleeping on the streets or in public parks? Can the state prevent people from doing drugs on the street until they die? What is the compassionate option? What was Gavin Newsom just talking about when he said, the governor of California, he could not help people get the help they needed to escape the cycle of addiction? These are some of the hardest questions facing American society today. And that court ruling the governor was talking about is under discussion right now by the Supreme Court of the United States. My friend, Sacramento District Attorney Thien invited me to join him in the audience of the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, to hear them discuss exactly these cases, Grants Pass and Martin versus Boise.
My name is Thien. I am the elected district attorney of Sacramento County. I've been in office now for a little bit over a year, about a year and a half.
Thien is a fighter for the people of Sacramento and California. He's seen firsthand the impact of homelessness and addiction on our communities. The case we saw that morning was known as the Grants Pass case. In 2020, Blake v. Grants Pass was filed over the ability of the homeless plaintiffs to sleep in public parks. In particular, the judge ruled Grants Pass, the city in Oregon, had to have enough shelter beds to fit all homeless individuals in the community in order to clear an encampment, not just one for that particular individual. It reaffirmed a previous lawsuit called Martin v. Boise in 2018, which said clearing any tent was considered cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment. Let me repeat that for you because it's very subtle. If you have 10,000 homeless people, then you have to create 10,000 beds before you can compel even one homeless person to get into treatment or out of the cycle of living on the street. So you might have 1,000 beds open, but you still can't do anything about the problem. And that's what Gavin Newsom was talking about at the beginning of this video. He's putting billions of dollars to work trying to fix the homelessness problem in California. And he knows this ruling needs a new interpretation. Here he is discussing exactly how his goals require a new interpretation of Grants Pass and Martin v. Boise.
Are you going to wait on putting some of that money out the door until you see how the High Court acts?
No. This encampment resolution grant addresses a lot of those concerns as it relates to Boise and Grants Pass. And that said, we still need the flexibility and the common sense that would be provided under a more lenient interpretation. And that's why we did the amicus brief. That's why we'll be tuning in to the oral arguments on Monday. And we're hopeful, but we can't wait. We're not going to wait. To your question specifically, we cannot wait. People they're fed up. They want to see action and no more scapegoating or finger pointing. This is a real issue. The impediments under Grants Pass and the courts have imposed. It's a real issue. It's not us abdicating.
Many city leaders who have tried to deal with keeping the order and trying to ensure public safety have come to believe it is this specific judicial ruling that makes it far more difficult to deal with the cycle of drug addiction, mental illness, violence, and death on the streets.
I think that the Supreme Court is going to verify this or support it, is that the Ninth Circuit and the District Court in San Francisco got that wrong. And they simply are, because what the courts are saying in the Ninth Circuit, some courts are saying, you have to have enough shelter space for every single homeless person in your jurisdiction. So if you have 1,000 homeless people in your jurisdiction, you have to have 1,000 beds available, or you can't enforce any of these laws. That's what some courts are saying, and that is wrong. I think what the Supreme Court was saying today, and even some of the lawyers here, was that it's an individualized question, an individualized analysis. This person right here, Garry, do we have shelter space for Garry? We don't need it for the 999 other people. We just need it for Garry before we can apply the law to Garry. And so if the shelter space is available to you and you refuse shelter, then you're not criminalizing the status of being homeless, because you're offered shelter and now you're voluntarily saying no. So therefore, the law can be enforced to you. So I think really that's what this court at a minimum is going to say, is that it should really apply just to you and not to every single person. Do we have enough shelter space for Garry? Do we have enough for this person, whoever it is that law enforcement or the navigators are speaking to? And I think that's where it's going to come down.
We're just aligned with common sense. To me, this is not ideological. There's a morality to this. I've been on the front lines of this for years and years and years, as I said, as former, not just mayor, but also a county supervisor and as governor directly. To me, just about common sense, not about ideology.
Now, what exactly was the core of the debate at the Supreme Court? Here's Thien again.
They were debating and arguing the issue of what is considered status and what is considered conduct, whether or not people were being criminalized for being the status of being homeless, or whether it was the conduct of doing something illegal, such as urinating, defecating, starting fires in public, or illegally trespassing. And that was a really core debate there as we listened.
One of the big questions under debate was whether the status of being homeless is a class or status.
And you shouldn't criminalize somebody for being an alcoholic, but you can criminalize them for driving drunk or being drunk in public. So there's a difference there of criminalizing the conduct of being drunk in public, criminalizing them for driving under the influence of alcohol versus just being an alcoholic. That's the distinction between the two. The law allows you to criminalize conduct, but not the status of being an alcoholic. That's a real simple example of that. And some would argue that being homeless is a status, like being an alcoholic. But I disagree with that, because some individuals choose to be homeless. They choose to reject shelter. And we see that again and again. For example, in Sacramento County, we had 600 people offered shelter and services and only 7 people accepted. And so that is a choice. And when that becomes a choice, it's no longer a status, it is a conduct. And so there was a lot of debate about status versus conduct, but what we really need to get at is free will.
In California, there are almost 180,000 homeless people for whom this question matters. What Democrats in power, like Gavin Newsom, are fighting for is a compassionate response, and I agree. Ask yourself this: what should the state do for those who are most vulnerable? Is it compassionate to let people do drugs until they die on the streets?
In the last 7 years, Sacramento has seen an unhoused increase by 250%, more than any location in the entire country. And California has seen over a 50% increase in the last several years of homelessness. When we're looking at San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, San Diego, Sacramento, it is not compassionate to let people die in the streets. In fact, I think our communities are really stuck between chaos and compassion. And so what is Grants Pass? And what, more importantly, is Martin versus Boise, which is the case that everything is based on? So a little history lesson. Back in 2018, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals the most overruled circuit in the entire country, said that you cannot essentially prevent people from sleeping in public. You can't outlaw homelessness or outlaw camping in all places at all times. And when it did that, it found that by doing so, you were criminalizing homelessness, that people had a right to sleep, and because they had a right to sleep, they could sleep where they wanted to sleep. And so that was essentially, in a nutshell, Martin versus Boise. And it goes back to homelessness. Is it a status or is it a conduct that we're prosecuting?
To understand Grants Pass, you have to go back to a prior Supreme Court case called Robinson. Robinson said you cannot make a status like being addicted to drugs a crime. Those arguing in favor of keeping Grants Pass, the ruling as it is, believe being homeless is the same as being addicted to drugs as a status.
And in the Robinson case, what that particular jurisdiction did was it outlawed or it criminalized the fact that you were a drug addict. And the Supreme Court says, you know what? You cannot outlaw status, the status of being a drug addict. Now you can outlaw and you can make criminal the conduct of using drugs in public. So then it started this really difference between status and conduct. And that's what we saw played out today in court. This is the most important case when it comes to homelessness, probably in the last 40 years.
What's changed? What happened between then and now? How did Grants Pass in 2020 and Martin v. Boise in 2018 get this quite so wrong? Well, one thing that happened in just the past few years was that fentanyl did not reach those cities quite yet, and now it's here. Fentanyl is the killer.
Right here is the package of sugar, right? I picked this up this morning when we were having coffee. This packet right here, if it contained fentanyl, it would be enough fentanyl to kill 500 people. All it takes is a few grains of fentanyl to kill every person in this room right now. And last year, law enforcement seized enough fentanyl in the state of California to kill every person on the face of the earth. Fentanyl is unlike any other drug that we're dealing with right now. The synthetic form of fentanyl is 50 times more addictive than heroin. 50 times more addictive than heroin. The high is tremendously high and then you drop off from it. So we see on the West Coast right now, we're about 5 years behind the East Coast in terms of drug trends. It's just the way it is. But in Sacramento County last year, we had over 400 people die from fentanyl poisoning. The two main causes of death of people living on the streets unhoused is number one, drug overdose, primarily from fentanyl, and the other is blunt force trauma. Take that in for a moment.
In San Francisco, that number per year is 806 as of 2023. That's 2 to 3 people dying every single day, and we're still tracking on that terrible rate even now this year.
The number one cause and the number two cause of death for the unhoused, it's not exposure to the elements. It really comes down to drug addiction and overdose and blunt force trauma. So it's not compassionate to let people live on the streets this way. 9 out of 10 women who are chronically homeless for more than a year, have been victims of sexual assault. It's not compassionate to the unhoused or to the housed. And fentanyl is driving a big factor in driving homelessness and the related crimes associated with it. When you look at a study out of Stanford, 8 out of 10 people that are chronically homeless for more than a year suffer from mental health and drug addiction. One of the things that we're trying to do is pass common sense laws that allow us to incentivize and encourage people to accept shelter and services.
I asked Thien what this case means to his fight to serve Sacramento and his communities. What happens next in the Supreme Court case?
So what do we expect to happen in the next couple of months? The Supreme Court will make a decision on this case, and they will make a decision by the end of June, by the end of their term. And depending upon how the courts go on this case, what the Supreme Court ultimately decide, it'll either allow the cities and the states on the West Coast and the Ninth Circuit to have more tools to incentivize people to accept services and shelter, or it's gonna really tie our hands. So that's really what's at stake. And you see it in San Francisco, injunction after injunction, really stopping law enforcement, but stopping navigators and stopping the city from clearing encampments down in San Diego, in San Jose, in Sacramento. So we're really at a crossroad. Is the Supreme Court going to give us more tools to incentivize people to accept services and shelter, or are they going to tie our hands? We're going to find out.
California and San Francisco in particular is controlled essentially by nonprofits and bureaucrats who deeply believe in a specific policy called Housing First. They've made it illegal for California to even pay for sober, permanent supportive housing, and they force cities and the state to spend the most amount of money on permanent supportive housing, the most expensive type of housing possible. This type of housing is in such short supply and so expensive, it's nearly impossible to get. And this Housing First policy actually basically results in defunding shelters, which is the kind of bed at night that would normally be the first step to getting people off the streets.
We give you shelter. We don't impose any rules or regulations. You can use drugs if you want. You can do whatever you want. There's no accountability with it. So in Canada, they had two cohorts, two groups. One that was a housing first approach, and one, the government offered no services, nothing. At the end of the day, the group that got a housing first approach ended up had a higher rate of unhoused and homelessness than the group where nobody did anything. It simply doesn't work. The housing first approach, as Tom Wolfe talked about, really inhibits people from getting the services and the help they need.
A compassionate and effective alternative to Housing First is Recovery First, with programs like Haven for Hope leading the way.
Instead of the Housing First approach, we have the Haven for Hope model in San Antonio. And what we're trying to create the Haven for Hope model in Sacramento. And how that works is this. Let's say somebody picks up a petty theft, pick up a drug offense, a trespassing offense, but all these different misdemeanor nonviolent offenses is because the individual is addicted to drugs or they're suffering from mental health, drug addiction, etc. Instead of being taken to jail, they get taken to the Haven for Hope location where they'll be assessed. They'll go through an assessment, the reasons why they are there, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's mental health. What is it that is causing some of this criminogenic behavior? And then if they are open and willing to accepting treatment after that triage assessment, then they go through the treatment program. And if they complete it, their nonviolent criminal offense gets dismissed and expunged. And if not, then they come see me over at the DA's office. But this is an approach where we marry in essentially accountability, but also compassion. Compassion in terms of providing treatment, but then accountability that you need to accept these services and go through this program, or you're gonna end up through the criminal justice system seeing me. So this is a system where there is accountability.
Compassion is caring, which means getting people off the drugs. I think it is institutional indifference, allowing people to do drugs until they die, that is dangerous and terrible. We want compassion. We don't want institutional indifference.
And there's a balanced approach there. I don't want to incarcerate people. I don't want to put people in jail or send prison when we can find ways to really address the underlying issue. But if you are, let's say, facing some drug offense and you're offered from the judge saying, look, you can stay in jail for a day, you can get a fine, or you can go a treatment program. What are you going to want? You're going to take the path of least resistance, because going through rehab, going through all those steps, really holding yourself accountable day in and day out, dealing with the demons of drug addiction and mental health is really difficult. And so then the path of least resistance is taking a fine or credit time served or a day and two in jail and then leaving and being out on the streets and getting to use drugs again. They're going to pick the path of least resistance. So all we're asking is the ability to be able to have some accountability, not to put people in jail or prison, but to incentivize them and get them the treatment, encourage them that they have. That's what we need.
One of the things I love about the district attorney is that he is willing to say the things that will stand up for the citizens of Sacramento, including our people, the Asian Americans. It was odd to say, but we were just one of a handful of Asian Americans in the courthouse that day. And we weren't that happy about that.
We were two of maybe a handful of APIs in the courtroom. And what that tells us that we've come a long way We've come a long way in this country, but we have much further to go. It was something that you brought me back to that. And I think about the time when I was wearing a suit and tie like I am right now. And I was the supervisor of the gang team, the hate crime team, and the major narcotic team. And I'm walking down the hallway at the courthouse in Sacramento, and this attorney yelled out, "Are you the interpreter?" Yelled out to me if I was the interpreter. We have to recognize how far we've come, but how far we have yet to go. And here, you and I are sitting in the highest court in the land. You, a successful, cutting-edge entrepreneur, and then me, the first Vietnamese elected district attorney in the entire country, one of just perhaps 10 elected district attorney that is of API descent, that happens to be an immigrant, that somehow was able to sit in that courtroom, eligible to practice before the Supreme Court of the United States. Where else in the world can we achieve what we did and be where we are today, except here? It was an absolute amazing experience to sit in the Supreme Court and watch the 9 justices argue a case, be able to agree and disagree, to listen to their questions, to listen to the different points of view. And only in this country do we have an opportunity to do just that. I have a belief, and it rests, in the hollow of those justices' hands, that justice will be done at the end of the day, and that I think that we're going to find a way to deal with our unhoused crisis where we balance compassion and accountability.
That's it for this week. I know this was an extra long one, but I think these are some of the most important and gnarly issues facing American society today. We're not always going to get it right on the first try, but through iteration, through debate, and through smart people like you paying attention and fighting for what's right, we will prevail and overcome. I'll see you next time.